Introduction: The Sound of Death. Have you ever heard the sound of a nation dying? In the autumn of 216 BC, inside the great hall of the Carthaginian Senate, that sound was like a golden rain. Mago, the younger brother of Hannibal, poured 3 bushels, 200 solid pounds of blood-stained gold rings onto the marble floor like he was dumping trash. That crisp, dense, bone-chilling clatter lasted for a full minute. Every senator in the room knew exactly what this meant. Every single ring in that pile had been sliced off the finger of a Roman nobleman or knight on the battlefield of Cannae. The Carthaginians cheered wildly. They were certain that their savage rival from Italy had finally taken its last breath. But they made a fatal mistake. They thought this pile of gold rings was the tombstone of the Roman Empire, but in reality, it was the countdown to Hannibal's own destruction. The Reign of Rings. The Silent Harbor and the Roaring Senate. If you could travel back to the North African coast in the autumn of 216 BC, the first thing to hit your senses wouldn't be the noise of war, but the suffocating heat and an eerie sense of prosperity. This is Carthage, the heart of the ancient Mediterranean, an empire of merchants and sailors, and the richest city on earth at the time. Imagine floating above the massive circular naval harbor of Carthage. The sun is blinding. The air is a thick mix of eastern spices, rotting seaweed, and the sharp, stinging smell of tar from the shipyards. Even during wartime, this place runs like a precision Swiss watch. Hundreds of triremes sit in the docks like sleeping beasts, waiting for the order to launch. But today, the atmosphere is different. The air in the entire city feels solid. Every pair of eyes, from the dock workers to the aristocrats in their hilltop mansions, is focused on one place, the Senate. Because a fast ship from Italy has just docked. The man who stepped off that ship is Hannibal Barca. You've heard of Hannibal, the demon who makes Romans wake up screaming. But Mago, his own brother, is the most critical messenger of this war. He isn't here for a vacation. Look at him walking down the gangway. His armor isn't shining. It's covered in a thick layer of grayish-brown dust. Remember that detail. That isn't African sand. That is the dirt of the Cannae plain in Italy, mixed with the dried, blackened blood of Romans. Surrounded by guards, he cuts through the crowded streets of Carthage. He doesn't ride a horse, he chooses to walk. This is a calculated psychological move. With every step, the heavy clank of metal on his war boots against the stone pavement announces to this skeptical city, the truth of the war has arrived. And inside the seat of power, that magnificent Senate hall built of marble and cedar, a silent war has already begun. 300 of the most powerful men in Carthage are sitting there. They aren't warriors, they are merchants, bankers, and landlords. Their robes are dyed with expensive Tyrian purple, and their fingers are heavy with jeweled rings. They don't care about honor, they care about profit margins. The hall is divided into 2 distinct camps. On the left is the Barca faction, supporters of Hannibal. They are anxious, excited, their eyes burning with the fanaticism of a gambler about to win big. They have drained their family fortunes investing in Hannibal over the last few years, and they desperately need good news to save their crumbling confidence. On the right sits the conservative faction, led by Hanno the Great. Hanno, an old man with a cold, calculating face, stares at the door like he's auditing a financial statement. To him, Hannibal isn't a hero, he's a bottomless pit draining Carthage's blood. In his own memos, or what we might call the risk assessment reports of that era, Hanno once wrote, "War is poison to a merchant. As long as the Romans control the Sicilian waters, our merchant ships cannot leave port. Does Hannibal killing people in Italy help me sell my olive oil in Greece? No." This was Carthage, divided, greedy, shrewd, yet holding complex feelings for that genius general far overseas. The buzzing in the hall gets louder until... bang! The heavy scented doors are thrown open. Sunlight slices into the dim hall, dust dancing in the beams. Mago stands in the doorway, backlit, his shadow stretching long across the floor like a ghost from hell. Dead silence. 300 pairs of eyes lock onto this young man. Mago doesn't bow, he doesn't offer pleasantries. His eyes sweep over every man in the room with the specific contempt of a man who has seen hell looking at flowers in a greenhouse. He strides to the center of the hall, followed by slaves struggling under a heavy load.
Watch those slaves. Their shoulders are sagging, muscles tight, every step a struggle. They are carrying 3 massive sacks sewn from coarse burlap. The bottoms of the sacks are distorted by the weight, and you can even hear the dull friction of metal grinding against metal inside. Crunch. Crunch. That is the weight of death. Mago stops in front of Hanno. The young general smiles a cruel smile. He knows that what is about to happen will shatter these old men's entire worldview. He doesn't even speak, he just tilts his chin slightly and gives a simple hand signal to the slaves. Pour it out. 300 bushels of fear. With that command, the slaves grab the bottom of the sacks and heave them upward. Whoosh! The sound. The first thing to hit your brain isn't the visual, it's the sound. It's not the pleasant tinkling of coins hitting a table. It is a dull, dense, continuous roar of thousands upon thousands of metal rings smashing against the marble floor like a torrential storm. 1 second. 2 seconds. 10 seconds. A golden flood pours from the sacks, bouncing, rolling, and piling up. The gold glitters in the dim hall, stinging everyone's eyes. When the last ring rolls to Hanno's feet and spins to a stop, the hall falls into dead silence again. But this silence is different. It is a physical suffocation. Everyone is staring at that golden pyramid. Mago finally speaks. His voice is raspy, the result of shouting over the Danelfe too long. If you want a battle report, Mago points to the pile of gold. This is the battle report. He bends down, grabs a handful of rings, and lets them slip through his fingers. Every ring here once sat on the left hand of a Roman. But take note, ordinary Roman soldiers only wear iron rings. Only the equites, the legion commanders, and the senators are entitled to wear gold rings. Mago's gaze becomes as sharp as a knife. In Cannae, we didn't just kill Roman soldiers, we killed Rome's brain. Commotion starts to ripple through the hall. Senators whisper, fear and greed intertwining on their faces. How many? Someone asks, trembling. How much is here? We didn't count, Mago answers coldly. About 3.5 bushels. In weight, over 200 pounds. In lives, this represents at least 20% of the Roman Republic's ruling class turned into fertilizer in a single afternoon. Can you imagine that concept? Imagine if today a disaster struck Washington, D.C., and 1/5 of all senators, Pentagon generals, and top Wall Street bankers died on the same day. This isn't a military victory, this is the collapse of a social structure. According to the customs of a time, this wasn't just loot, it was humiliation. In ancient warfare, stripping armor was normal, but collecting rings, that is extreme psychological warfare. Hannibal ordered his soldiers to cut off these rings just to make this moment in Carthage happen. He needed these merchants, sitting far in the rear and always hesitating, to see with their own eyes. Rome, that arrogant giant, has been dismembered. They are finished. A young senator from the Barca faction jumps up, his voice cracking with excitement. Rome is finished. We won. That sentence is like a spark falling into a barrel of oil. Instantly, ecstasy drowns out reason. The Senate hall turned into a madhouse. Robes wave in the air, men hug each other, weeping and howling. Bankers, who are usually the stingiest people alive, are now shouting promises to ship supplies to Hannibal. They can already see the scene of Rome being looted, seeing all the trade routes of the Mediterranean flying the Carthaginian flag again. In this chaotic jubilation, Mago stands by the pile of gold rings, arms crossed, enjoying the belated glory. But he doesn't notice, or perhaps he chooses to ignore, that amidst the fanatic crowd, Hanno is still sitting in his chair. The old man hasn't stood up. He isn't looking at the gold. His gaze looks past Mago, staring at a point in the void. His brow is furrowed, and his fingers are unconsciously tapping the armrest. As a seasoned politician and merchant, Hanno's instinct tells him that things are too perfect. In business, if a deal looks too good to be true, it's usually a trap. Hanno slowly stands up. His movements are slow but carry an undeniable authority. The crowd surrounding him gradually quiets down because they realize the great has something to say. Hanno pushes past the people in front of him and walks to the pile of gold rings. He gently kicks the spoils that symbolize a glorious victory with the toe of his shoe, making a crisp clattering sound. Then he looks up at Mago and asks the questions that will go down in history and unveil the prologue to Carthage's destruction. This is indeed an impressive gift, Mago. Hanno's voice is terrifyingly calm. It proves you killed many Romans. I no longer doubt that. But Hanno's tone shifts, his eyes becoming sharp. I want to ask 3 simple questions.
The audit from hell. The air in the hall seems to freeze. Hanno's voice isn't loud, but in the deathly silence, every word strikes Mago, and every Carthaginian immersed in the fantasy of victory like a whip. Hanno holds up a single finger, thin as a twig but steady as a scepter. First question, Mago. Hanno stares at the young general. You say you annihilated Rome's main force, so have any of Rome's Latin allies in Italy, the Samnites, the Etruscans, the Campanians, betrayed Rome and defected to us? This is a lethal question. You have to understand, Rome's power wasn't just in the city of Rome itself, but in the massive Italian federation it built. Carthage's strategic core had always been clear. Hannibal didn't enter Italy to attack the city of Rome, but to dismantle this alliance. As long as the allies defected, Rome would become an isolated island and collapse on its own. Mago's face changes slightly. He tries to remain calm, but the darting of his eyes betrays him. He clears his throat, his voice no longer as high-pitched as before. Well, there hasn't been a massive defection yet. Although some small towns have shown interest, the major Latin states still stand with Rome. Still stand with Rome, Hanno repeats the phrase, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Then he raises a second finger. Second question. Of the 80,000 men surrounded at Cannae, when they realized death was certain, did a single Roman legion lay down its arms and surrender to Hannibal as a complete unit? This is an audit of morale. In ancient warfare, when casualties exceeded 30%, armies would usually collapse, flee, or surrender. That is the sign of the end of a battle. Mago's lips press tight, his Adam's apple bobbing. He recalls the images of the Cannae battlefield, those surrounded Roman soldiers, even with hands and legs severed, still using their teeth to tear at Carthaginian soldiers' legs, that madness that made even the victors tremble. No, Mago answers dryly. No surrender. They fought to the last man or chose suicide. Hanno nods, as if the answer was exactly what he expected. Then he raises a third finger. Last question, and the most important one. Hanno leans forward, his eyes blazing. Since you achieved such a glorious victory, since Rome has lost its protection, has the Roman Senate sent anyone? Have they sent envoys begging for peace, or even just asking for the price to ransom prisoners? The entire room holds its breath. This is the question every merchant present cares about most. War is for profit, and a peace treaty is the check that cashes in that profit. If Rome doesn't sue for peace, this war means burning more money. Mago remains silent for a long time. He looks at the gold rings on the floor. They are evidence of victory, but in this moment, in front of Hanno's 3 questions, this pile of gold suddenly seems meaningless. No, Mago whispers. No envoys. No letter for peace. Nothing. Ha! Hanno suddenly lets out a short, cold laugh, sitting back in his chair, spreading his hands to the bewildered senators around him. So, my friends, what exactly have we won? We killed their men, but we didn't kill their will. We destroyed their army, but we didn't destroy their alliance. We won the battlefield, but we haven't won the war. Hanno points at Mago, his tone becoming severe. Young man, this pile of gold rings you brought back is not Rome's epitaph. It is a declaration of war. It tells us that our opponent is not a normal nation. They are a monster. If you cut off its head, it doesn't die. It grows 2 more vicious heads. In that moment, the temperature in the Carthaginian Senate hall drops to freezing. The champagne and celebration banquets that were being prepared suddenly seem tasteless. This is the power of logic. With 3 questions, Hanno stripped away the gaudy coat of victory, revealing the terrifying truth underneath. Rome refuses to acknowledge defeat. But the story isn't over. Although Hanno saw through the truth, he still underestimated the extent of Rome's madness. What happened next was something even a calculating man like Hanno could never have imagined. The red dust. The silent red dust. Let's leave the oppressive council chamber of Carthage for a moment, cross the Mediterranean, and return to the Italian peninsula. We are going to the source of the dust on Mago's boots, Cannae. It is the morning after the battle ended. The sun rises as usual, illuminating the plain. If you stood here, you would see the most spectacular and disgusting scene in human history. The plain, for miles around, is paved with corpses, not scattered, but stacked.
In some places, the piles of bodies are taller than a man. The air is filled with a specific smell of rust, the scent of tens of thousands of gallons of blood oxidizing under the scorching sun. Vultures and wild dogs gather from all directions to enjoy the feast. Hannibal rides his horse, slowly inspecting his masterpiece. As a tactician, he has just completed a perfect painting. He won with fewer numbers, executing a textbook pincer movement. This is the pinnacle every general dreams of. But there is no smile on Hannibal's face. His lieutenant, Maharbal, rides behind him, his face flushed with excitement. Maharbal waves his sword, shouting at Hannibal, "General, if you give the order right now, send the cavalry first and follow with the main force, within 5 days we can be eating dinner on the Capitoline Hill in Rome." It is a tempting offer. Strike the heart, kill the sick man while he's down. Hannibal stops his horse and turns to look at his lieutenant. His eyes are deep and complex. He is hesitating. Historians have argued for 2,000 years, why didn't Hannibal march on Rome after the great victory at Cannae? Was it a lack of food? A lack of siege engines? Perhaps the real answer lies in the details Hannibal saw. When inspecting the battlefield, Hannibal saw a wounded Roman soldier. The soldier's legs had been severed, but he wasn't waiting to die. He was using his hands to claw at the ground, dragging his broken body inch by inch towards a rock. What was he doing? Hannibal watched quietly. The soldier crawled to the rock, grabbed a sharp shard of stone, not to attack the approaching Carthaginians, but to start sharpening his sword. Even with only one breath left, even with his legs gone, the instinct of this Roman was, prepare to fight. A chill ran down Hannibal's spine. He realized he wasn't facing an army of mercenaries. Carthage's army fought for money. If they lost, they scattered. If they won, they got a bonus. But the Romans, these citizen soldiers fought for an abstract concept called the state. If you kill 10,000 mercenaries, you destroy an army. But if you kill 10,000 citizens with this kind of belief, you only create 10,000 martyrs and enrage the remaining 1 million. Maharbal looked at the hesitating Hannibal and uttered the famous line that has echoed through the ages. "Hannibal, you know how to gain a victory, but you do not know how to use one." Hannibal didn't argue. He looked towards the distant north, the direction of Rome. His gut told him that city wasn't a frightened sheep pen right now, but a hornet's nest that had just been kicked. Charging in now might mean being completely overwhelmed. History proved Hannibal's instinct was right, but at the same time, this was his greatest tragedy, because in the very moment Hannibal hesitated, inside the city of Rome, a mechanism of social mobilization unprecedented in human history was activating. It wasn't sadness, and it wasn't even fear. It was the roar of a cold machine starting up.
The city that forbid tears. The city where sorrow is illegal. Let's switch the camera to the city of Rome. The news arrived at sunset. A blood-soaked cavalryman stumbled through the city gates. He didn't even have the strength to speak. He just shook his head in despair. Rumors spread like a virus through the narrow streets. "The consuls are dead. The legions are wiped out. Hannibal is coming." Women rushed into the streets, screaming the names of husbands and sons. Temples were packed with praying people. Panic burned like wildfire, threatening to turn into a riot at any moment. If someone shouted, "Run, right now!" the city would collapse instantly. At this critical tipping point of chaos, the doors of the Senate opened. Walking out wasn't a general in armor, but a group of old men in white togas. Their leader was Fabius Maximus. Fabius's face showed no emotion. He didn't comfort the crowd. He didn't say, "Everything will be all right." Instead, he issued a series of orders so cold they didn't seem human. First order, seal the city gates. No one, civilian or noble, leaves the city without permission. Violators will be beheaded. This meant no refugees. Everyone is locked on this sinking ship. Second order, limit mourning. All crying and funeral rites must end within 30 days.
Women are forbidden from tearing their hair or screaming in public. This meant grief is nationalized. The state doesn't have time for you to cry. The state needs you to shut up and get to work. Third order, intelligence control. All news from the front lines must go to the Senate for censorship before being released. This meant managing panic. Truth is classified as a controlled substance. But the most shocking part was their attitude toward the envoys sent by Hannibal. A few days later, Hannibal did send men, not to sue for peace, but to negotiate prisoner ransoms. Hannibal held thousands of Roman captives, and he offered a very reasonable price. For Rome, desperate for manpower, buying back these veterans seemed the only choice. Families of the captives gathered at the Senate doors, bringing their life savings, weeping and begging the Senate to agree to the ransom. It was a dilemma between morality and survival. The Senate debated fiercely. Finally, they made a decision. The consul walked out the door and announced to the expectant crowd, "Rome does not ransom prisoners." The crowd exploded. "Why? That's my son! You need soldiers!" The consul's answer was as cold as stone. Because they surrendered on the battlefield, Rome has no need for soldiers who choose to live while they still hold a weapon. Let them rot in Carthaginian chains. This will teach the remaining Romans one thing. In this war, there are only two choices, victory or death. There is no third way. This was Rome's answer. This wasn't strategy, it was a sacrifice. The Senate used the lives of thousands of prisoners to send a signal to the entire nation. The state has cut off all avenues of retreat. This extreme cruelty had a miraculous effect. The crying stopped, the panic vanished, replaced by a silent, cold rage. The legions of the damned. The oath to break taboos. When the news that the Senate refused to ransom the prisoners spread, Rome fell into a strange state. It wasn't calm, it was the hissing sound of a pressure cooker about to explode. Manpower was exhausted. Look at the data. After the battles of Lake Trasimene and Cannae, Rome lost about 100,000 adult males. Adjusted for population, that's equivalent to the United States losing every male citizen between the ages of 20 and 30 in a single year. The draft lists were empty. Even underage boys, 17-year-olds without even a whisper of a beard, were conscripted. By conventional logic, there were only two choices left: surrender or hire foreign mercenaries. But the Romans chose a third path, one that disgusted and terrified the entire ancient world. They turned their eyes to the slaves. In ancient Roman values, a slave was a tool that speaks. Letting slaves pick up weapons to defend the state was an insult to Mars, the god of war, and a trampling of Roman honor. If slaves could fight, what nobility did citizens have left? But Roman consul Tiberius Gracchus walked into the slave market. He wasn't buying servants, he was buying lives. The state paid market price for 8,000 strong-bodied slaves. Imagine the scene. In the square at the foot of the Capitoline Hill, 8,000 slaves had their shackles removed. They thought they were being sold to farms for hard labor or to the arena to die. But now, piled in front of them was standard Roman legionary equipment: short swords, tall shields, javelins. Gracchus stood on a platform and said one sentence to the absolute bottom rung of society, a sentence that shattered centuries of Roman class barriers. As long as you bring back the heads of the enemy, you are no longer slaves. You will be freemen, volones. This was the first slave legion in Roman history. To arm these men, Rome didn't even have enough weapons. The Senate ordered trophies taken from enemies over the past centuries to be pulled down from temple walls. It was a highly symbolic moment. Slaves wearing Gaulish armor, holding Samnite shields, gripping Etruscan swords, yet swearing allegiance to Rome. At the same time, another insane draft was happening in the prisons. Debtors, thieves, felons were dragged out. The judges told them, "Your sentences are canceled. Now your prison is the battlefield, and your jailers are the Carthaginians. Survive, and you are innocent." This was Rome's systemic madness. If you were a Carthaginian spy hidden in Rome seeing this, you wouldn't find it funny. You would feel deep terror, because you were seeing a civilization tearing up its most sacred social rules just to survive. This was no longer a nation fighting. This was a wounded beast eating its own flesh to grow new claws. But you think that's the ruthless part? No. Rome's treatment of its own people was even crueler than its treatment of slaves. This brings us to the group forgotten by history, the ghost legions, the living dead not allowed in the city. Let's move our gaze from the noise of Rome to the south, the direction the Cannae survivors fled. About 10,000 Roman soldiers escaped that slaughter. They weren't cowards, they were men who broke out in organized groups after the line collapsed, or crawled out from under piles of dead. By all rights, they were heroes. They witnessed hell and survived. When these ragged, blood-soaked soldiers returned to Roman-controlled territory, they expected hot soup, hugs, and comfort. But waiting for them were cold stares and locked city gates. The Roman Senate passed a special decree targeting the Cannae survivors. Every word of this decree was sharper than Hannibal's sword. These soldiers abandoned their commanders and comrades on the battlefield. They do not deserve to be called Romans. The sentence was as follows. 1. Stripped of citizenship. They were organized into a special penal legion. 2. Permanent exile. They were shipped to Sicily. They were forbidden from stepping foot on Italian soil until the war ended. 3. Humiliating conditions. They were forbidden from staying in towns overnight, forbidden from public banquets, forbidden from marrying. Try to feel that despair. You just crawled through piles of dead friends for 3 days and nights, finally made it home, only to find your country throwing you out like trash. Your wife is just 30 miles away, but you might never see her again. These soldiers were shipped to Sicily, far from the front lines, no honor, just endless patrol duties and the scorn of the locals. These were the legiones Cannenses, the ghost legions. They were alive, but in the eyes of Roman law, they were already dead. However, history is full of irony. It was precisely this almost perverted harshness that forged a sword of vengeance. In the long, boring years on Sicily, these 10,000 living dead didn't fall apart. Instead, hatred and shame became the strongest glue. They trained every day, not for their commanders, but to prove themselves. They silently polished their shields, practicing charges under the scorching sun. They had only one thought. One day, we will kill our way back to Africa and show those old men in the Senate who the real Romans are. All they needed was a chance and a leader who understood their madness. And that leader was waiting for them around the corner of destiny. The imitation game. The boy who watched his father fall.
On the battlefield of Cannae, besides the 80,000 corpses, there was a young witness. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was only 19 that year. He was a military prodigy. 2 years earlier, at the Battle of Ticinus, when his father, the Roman consul, was wounded and surrounded by Gallic cavalry, this boy, then only 17, charged into the enemy lines alone and saved his father. On the day of Cannae, he was a military tribune of the Second Legion. When the Roman army was surrounded and the slaughter began, Scipio maintained astonishing calm amidst the chaos. He didn't charge blindly like the others, nor did he collapse in suicide.
He keenly spotted a weak point in the Carthaginian encirclement and, leading a small group of men, carved a bloody path out. After escaping to the nearby town of Canusium, the surviving young officers fell into panic. Someone suggested, "Rome is finished. Let's run. Let's flee to Greece and serve foreign kings as mercenaries." It was a realistic proposal. The ships were in the harbor. Just jump on and leave this nightmare behind. Just as they were packing their bags, Scipio drew his sword. Bang! The blade slammed into the table, wood chips flying. A terrifying fire burned in young Scipio's eyes. He looked at these officers, all older than him, and swore an oath, word by word. "I, Publius Scipio, swear by Jupiter, I will never abandon the Roman Republic. If any of you try to run, I will kill you first, then myself." He forced everyone present to swear on his sword. That night, Rome's soul was forcibly shoved back into its body by this 19-year-old boy. But Scipio took away more than just courage. In the blood of Cannae, he saw something else. While others feared Hannibal's brutality, Scipio was observing Hannibal's art. He saw how Carthaginian cavalry used mobility to attack the flanks. He saw how Hannibal used terrain and psychological traps. He saw a brutal truth. The frontal phalanx charge Rome was so proud of was like a kindergarten game in front of a genius. Scipio realized that to defeat a monster, you must first become one. He began to deconstruct Hannibal's tactics in his mind. He stopped thinking like a Roman and started thinking like Hannibal. Years later, when Rome decided to launch a counterattack in Spain, Carthage's vast rear area, all the old generals refused to go because the previous commanders in Spain, including Scipio's father and uncle, had all died in battle. It was a death trap. Only 25-year-old Scipio stepped forward. "I'll go." The Senate looked at this young man, thinking he was going to his death, but they had no choice. Scipio arrived in Spain, but he didn't bring Rome's main forces. There he met a group of people, or rather, he actively sought them out. Those exiled, vengeance-hungry veterans known as the Disgrace. When a young genius met desperate avengers, a chemical reaction occurred. The lightning of New Carthage. 209 BC, Spain. Scipio's target was New Carthage. This was the capital of Carthaginian power in the Iberian Peninsula, their treasury, their armory, and their most important port. The city was considered impregnable. It sat on a peninsula, surrounded by water on 3 sides, connected to the mainland only by a narrow isthmus. The Carthaginians heavily guarded the land approach. According to traditional Roman warfare, this would be a long siege. You need siege towers, trenches, months, or even years. But Scipio didn't have time. He did something very un-Roman. He started gathering intelligence not about enemy troop numbers, but about tides. He heard from local fishermen that at a specific time of the season, when the low tide combined with a strong north wind, the water level in the lagoon north of the city would drop drastically, shallow enough to wade across. This was a secret only old local fishermen knew about. The arrogant Carthaginian commanders knew nothing of it. Scipio formulated a crazy plan. He ordered his main force to launch a suicidal frontal feint at the land gate. He wanted the Carthaginians to believe this was a typical, clumsy Roman attack. The Carthaginian defenders mocked the Roman stupidity, moving all their forces to the gate, raining down arrows and stones. Just as the battle reached its peak, the afternoon low tide arrived. The north wind howled. Scipio stood by the lagoon with 500 hand-picked commandos, many of them those Cannae veterans hungry to wash their shame. The water level actually dropped. Scipio pointed to the muddy shallows and shouted to his soldiers, "Look, Neptune opens the way for us. The gods are with us." This wasn't a miracle. It was science, but to the soldiers, it was divine will. These 500 avengers waded through the lagoon that was considered a natural barrier, like ghosts. They scaled the unguarded northern walls. While the Carthaginian defenders were celebrating repelling the Romans at the main gate, they suddenly heard Roman trumpets blasting from behind them. Can you imagine that terror? It's like focusing on the enemy in front of you in a game, only to realize the assassin is already standing next to your base. New Carthage, the crown jewel of the Carthaginian Empire, fell in a single day. This wasn't just a victory, it was a signal Scipio sent to Hannibal far away in Italy. I read your tactics. I can play this game too, and I play it crazier than you. The loot was mountainous. 18 warships, 600 tons of wheat, massive amounts of gold. But most importantly, Scipio released the 300 Spanish tribal hostages held in the city. These hostages were the children of Spanish tribal chiefs, the means Carthage used to control the region. Scipio didn't sell them as slaves, he sent them home with gifts. The result? The Spanish tribes instantly flipped, betraying Carthage and joining Rome. Do you see? This is what made Scipio terrifying. Tactically, he was as cunning as Hannibal, using tides to sneak attack. Strategically, he was as brilliant as Hannibal, using diplomacy to dismantle enemy alliances. Hannibal tried desperately to break Rome's alliance in Italy and failed. Scipio, in Spain, broke Carthage's alliance in a single battle. This is the highest level of the imitation game, not just copying your opponent, but surpassing him. But this was just a warm-up. Scipio knew that to truly defeat Hannibal, he had to solve a core flaw in the Roman army: rigidity. We are about to see how Scipio transformed the clumsy Roman phalanx into a lethal weapon that flowed like mercury. This military reform would directly decide the outcome of Zama.
The dance in the desert. Many people think the ancient Roman army was invincible from the start. That is a huge misconception. Before Cannae, the Roman legion was like a heavy sledgehammer, massive power, but slow. Once swung, it was hard to pull back. They relied on the manipular system in a rigid way. Soldiers lined up in 3 rows, advanced, threw javelins, and drew swords for the melee. This worked fine against Italian peasant militias, but against a tactical master like Hannibal, it was like a weightlifter trying to catch a nimble cheetah. What was Hannibal's army like? They were an artwork of combined arms. Numidian light cavalry for harassment, Spanish infantry for holding the line, Gallic warriors for shock, and those terrifying war elephants. Hannibal could command his troops to split, encircle, and retreat at any moment. In the training camps of Spain, Scipio did something that gave old-school Roman officers heart attacks. He abandoned the rigid 3-line formation. He started training soldiers in independent maneuvering. Imagine modern special forces training. Scipio required every sentry to be able to listen to commands independently and change direction on the battlefield instantly. Left face, break formation, circle to the rear, swap with friendlies. Under the scorching sun, the Cannae survivors and new recruits practiced these complex dance steps over and over. At first, it looked like a chaotic disaster, soldiers constantly crashing into each other. But slowly, a miracle happened. This clumsy army began to become liquid. They were no longer a dead wall, but a snake that could change shape at will. This was the prototype of the famous cohortal tactics. 206 BC, Battle of Ilipa. This was Scipio's final exam. His opponent was another of Hannibal's brothers, Hasdrubal Gisco, not the one who went to Italy to die, another one. The Carthaginian army had 50,000 men, Rome had only 40,000. For several days, Scipio ordered his soldiers to form up only at noon,
always placing his elite Roman heavy infantry in the center and his weaker Spanish allies on the wings. The Carthaginians got used to seeing this. They thought this was the Romans' fixed formation. But on the morning of the decisive battle, before the sun came up, Scipio ordered a full assault. And he secretly switched the formation. He put the weakest Spanish allies in the center and the strongest Roman legions on the wings. It was an incredibly bold gamble. When the Carthaginians rushed out, bleary-eyed, they found the Romans already closing in. Instinctively, they lined up according to the experience of the last few days, strongest against strongest. But when the lines met, the Carthaginians were dumbfounded. The Roman weak troops in the center didn't attack. They slowly retreated, keeping distance from the Carthaginian center. I won't hit you, you don't hit me. But on the wings, Scipio's elite legions suddenly accelerated like two giant pincers, crushing the weak Carthaginian flanks. Does this sound familiar? Exactly. It was a replica of Cannae. Only this time, the ones doing the encircling were Romans, and the ones being slaughtered were Carthaginians. Scipio perfectly replicated Hannibal's tactics and used them to destroy Carthage's last field army in Spain. After this battle, Carthage completely lost Spain. The vast rear that once provided Hannibal with endless silver and mercenaries was now Rome's springboard. Hannibal was still invincible in Italy, but he suddenly found himself an isolated force. His home had been stolen. Severing the arteries. The Second Avalanche. 207 BC. This was the year Rome should have died. Imagine the despair. You are a Roman. You've spent 11 years, paid with countless lives, barely learning how to survive in Hannibal's shadow. You're careful, never daring to fight him head-on, only nipping at his supply lines like a rat. But now, the nightmare news arrives. Above the snow line of the Alps, a second Carthaginian army has appeared. Hannibal's brother, Hannibal Barca, has crossed the mountains deemed an impenetrable barrier with a fresh army. And what terrified Rome most was that Hannibal crossed the Alps much faster than Hannibal did, with far fewer losses. Why? Because the local mountain tribes had already been beaten into submission by Hannibal, or bought off. Hannibal walked a paved road. What did this mean? In Bruttium, in South Italy, Hannibal sat in his main camp with about 40,000 elites. In the Po Valley of northern Italy, Hannibal had just arrived, holding 30,000 troops and constantly recruiting Gallic barbarians. If these two armies met in central Italy, their combined force would reach 100,000, led by two top-tier tacticians of the Barcide family. This wasn't just war anymore. This was Rome's death sentence. No tactics, no courage would mean anything against this absolute quantitative and qualitative advantage. It was a math problem. If the brothers met, Rome fell. All of Italy held its breath. Every eye was glued to those two red dots on the map, one north, one south, watching them inch closer. At this moment, fate was decided not by a general's sword, but by a letter. Hannibal sent 6 Numidian cavalrymen carrying a secret letter to his brother, Hannibal. The letter detailed the time and place of their meeting, Narni in Umbria. These 6 messengers moved like ghosts through Italy, dodging countless Roman patrols. They could even see the smoke from Hannibal's campfires. But at the last moment, taking a wrong turn down a small path, they ran into an insignificant Roman foraging party. It was a probability event as rare as winning the lottery, but as we said before, Rome's systemic advantage was that it fought on its own land. Its eyes were everywhere. The letter was delivered to the hands of Roman consul Gaius Claudius Nero. Nero was currently in a standoff with Hannibal in the south. He opened the letter and read it. In that moment, this general, known for his violent temper, made the craziest, most unconventional decision in Roman military history. According to Roman law, a consul could not leave his defense zone without permission. It was a capital offense. But Nero looked at the letter. He knew if he stuck to the law, Rome was dead. He decided to gamble everything. The March of Madness. Nero picked 7,000 of his absolute best soldiers, all men who could run and fight. He told them, dump all baggage, weapons and canteens only. We're going for a walk. Under the cover of night, these 7,000 men slipped out of camp. To keep Hannibal from noticing, Nero left most of the army behind and ordered them to maintain the original patrol frequency, even lighting extra campfires at night to create the illusion that the main force was still there. Hannibal, the master of deception, was deceived for the first time. He thought Nero was still staring him down across the field, so he stayed put, waiting for news from his brother. Meanwhile, Nero was sprinting hundreds of miles away. This is the famous interior lines maneuver. Nero's goal was to force march 250 miles north, link up with the other consul Livius, and destroy this northern army with a 2-on-1 advantage before Hasdrubal knew what hit him. It was a race against time. If Hannibal noticed Nero was gone and Hasdrubal started chasing, these 7,000 men would be crushed. Rome's logistics system showed its terrifying power in this moment. Nero sent cavalry ahead to notify towns along the route. Prepare food, prepare water, prepare wagons, not for sale, for survival. The scenes that followed shut the mouths of anyone who questioned Roman cohesion. Italian farmers, women, and old men along the road flooded onto the road known as the Via Flaminia. They held bread, dried meat, wine. The soldiers didn't even need to stop to eat. Civilians stuffed food into their hands and splashed water on them to cool them down. Soldiers who were injured or fell behind were picked up by villagers in wagons to catch up. No requisitioning, no looting. It was total mobilization. A journey that should have taken 10 days took Nero 6. This was an army driven by adrenaline. They knew they were running to a battle that would decide the fate of the world. When Nero's army arrived at the northern camp in the dead of night, to prevent Hasdrubal from detecting the increased numbers, Nero gave an order: do not pitch new tents. These 7,000 exhausted soldiers quietly squeezed into the tents of the existing garrison. From the outside, the camp looked exactly the same size. Hasdrubal looked at the Roman camp across the field and thought everything was normal. Until the next morning.
The delivery from hell. The morning of the Battle of the Metaurus, Hasdrubal rode out to observe the Roman formation. As Hannibal's brother, he had the same sharp intuition. He heard a subtle sound, a trumpet blast. If you were a layman, you'd think it was a standard charge call, but Hasdrubal heard the problem. Roman tradition dictated that each consul had a unique trumpet call. That morning, Hasdrubal heard 2 trumpet calls, one from Livius, one from Nero, who was supposed to be hundreds of miles south. Hasdrubal's face went pale. He realized something was wrong. Though he didn't know exactly what happened, he knew it was a trap. He tried to retreat, but confused guides and the swollen Metaurus River blocked his path. He was forced to fight with his back to the water. The battle was incredibly brutal. Hasdrubal's Spanish veterans and Gallic warriors showed amazing combat effectiveness. His elephants, in particular, caused huge trouble for the Romans. It was a stalemate. Then, Nero showed his tactical genius again. He found he couldn't break the terrain obstacles on the right flank to attack, so he did something against convention. He took his troops, marched around behind the Roman lines, and launched a surprise attack from the left flank. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. The Carthaginian army collapsed. Hasdrubal saw the end had come. He didn't choose to run. As a Barca, he had his pride. He didn't want to die like a hunted rabbit on the run.
Roman historian Livy recorded this tragic scene. Hasdrubal spurred his horse and charged into the densest Roman phalanx. He died fighting, like a true general. The battle was over. Rome won. But for Nero, the mission wasn't over. He had one last thing to do. He took his army and sprinted back south for another 6 days. When he returned to the southern camp, Hannibal was still there waiting. The genius was still in the dark, waiting for good news from his brother. Hannibal saw the commotion in the Roman camp. He thought Nero had just been out on a short patrol. Then a few Roman cavalrymen rode up to the Carthaginian camp. They didn't fire arrows, they threw a bundle. The bundle rolled on the ground and unraveled. It was Hasdrubal's head. Hannibal stared at that head. That was his own brother, who grew up with him, who swore with him to destroy Rome. That face was still frozen in the grimace of the final moment of battle. This was the ultimate psychological warfare. The Romans didn't just kill your reinforcements, they used the cruelest way to tell you, you are alone. History records that Hannibal remained silent for a long time. Finally, he said only one sentence, full of fatalism. I see the doom of Carthage. In that moment, the Hannibal who was once invincible, sweeping across Italy, died. What remained was an old man struggling to protect his remaining troops. Rome hadn't just severed Carthage's arteries, it had shattered Hannibal's hope. The hunter becomes the hunted. The gamble in Sicily. 205 BC, Rome. Scipio returned from Spain in triumph and elected consul. He proposed that bold plan, invade Africa. As long as we threaten Carthage itself, Hannibal must get out of Italy to defend his home. It was a perfect strategy of attacking the enemy's pace to relieve the siege. But the Senate exploded. Leading the opposition was the respected delayer Fabius. Fabius was old. He was terrified of Hannibal. His logic was, Hannibal is still in Italy. You're taking the army to Africa? What if Hannibal attacks Rome? You're gambling with the nation's fate. The Senate was jealous of Scipio's youth and fame. They feared Scipio would become another dictator. In the end, the Senate gave a humiliating compromise. Scipio, you can go to Sicily. If you want to go to Africa, that is your freedom, but the Senate will give you not a single soldier. You can take the garrison on Sicily. Beyond that, no budget, no recruits. This was sabotage. Everyone knew who the garrison on Sicily was. It was the 2 legions of canny losers. Those ghost legions exiled for 11 years, stripped of citizenship, viewed as Rome's shame. They were old, their gear was rotting, and morale was low, so the Senate thought. This would make Scipio back down, but they didn't understand Scipio, and they certainly didn't understand those veterans. Scipio arrived in Sicily. He walked into that forgotten camp. Imagine the scene, a radiant young consul in a red cloak standing before a group of weather-beaten veterans with dark, brooding eyes. These men were once Rome's elite. Now they lived like beggars. Scipio looked at them. No disgust, no lecture. He said, I know who you are. I was there too. Cannae. That single word shot through the crowd like electricity. They say you are cowards, Scipio's voice echoed across the parade ground, but I know the truth. You are men who survived hell. You hate Hannibal more than anyone because he took your honor. He took your lives. The Senate won't give me an army because they think you are trash. But I chose you. I'm taking you to Africa, not to die, but to take back what is yours. Follow me. We're going to burn Carthage. When we come back, if you haven't washed away the shame, you can kill me. Silence, then a low growl, finally a deafening roar. The souls of these 10,000 veterans were ignited. 11 years of suppression, grievance, and rage transformed into pure killing intent. They didn't need physical training, they needed a tactical upgrade. Scipio built a boot camp from hell in Sicily. He taught the cohortal tactics and the imitation tactics he learned in Spain to these veterans. The veterans learned at an astonishing speed because they knew this was the only chance in their lives to turn the tables. Meanwhile, volunteers from all over Italy heard Scipio was recruiting and flocked to him, bringing their own rations. They weren't fighting for the Senate, they were fighting for Scipio. An army of vengeance quietly took shape in Sicily. This army wasn't for defense, it was for offense. Every sword sharpened to a razor edge, every heart hungry for Carthaginian blood. The burning tents. 204 BC. Scipio lands in Africa. The Carthaginians panicked. They didn't expect the Romans to actually dare to come. They quickly organized two massive armies to meet them, one led by Hasdrubal Gisco, yes, him again, the one who ran from Spain, the other led by the Numidian king Syphax with a massive cavalry force. The armies faced off. Carthage still had the numbers. A long negotiation began. Scipio sent envoys every day to the enemy camp to discuss peace terms. It was another scam. These envoys were actually centurions and engineers in disguise. While negotiating, they didn't look at the enemy commanders, they stared at the camp layout. They discovered a fatal detail. The Carthaginian and Numidian tents were made of reeds and dry straw because Africa lacked timber, and these tents were packed tight, without fire lanes. Scipio smiled. On a moonless, windy night, Scipio ended negotiations. He split his forces. This wasn't a battle. This was arson. Roman soldiers quietly crept to the edge of the Numidian camp and lit the outer huts. The fire spiraled out of control instantly in the dry African wind. Numidians woke from their sleep, thinking it was an accidental fire, and rushed out naked to put it out. At that moment, Roman soldiers lying in ambush charged. It was a one-sided slaughter. Enemies without weapons, without armor, in total panic, were harvested in the sea of fire. People in the Carthaginian camp next door saw their allies burning and ran out to watch or help. Scipio's other force then lit the Carthaginian camp. That night was hell on earth for the Carthaginians. The fire lit up half the African sky. Records say 40,000 Carthaginian and Numidian soldiers were burned or killed that night. Roman losses? Minimal. This was Scipio's art of killing. He didn't care about chivalry. He only cared about winning. This fire burned away Carthage's last will to resist. The Carthaginian Senate finally broke. They issued the famous order, the order Rome had waited 15 years for. Recall Hannibal. On the seaside of southern Italy, Hannibal received the order. He looked at the land he had fought on for 15 years, at the familiar mountains and rivers. He knew he had failed, not on the battlefield, but in strategy. He grit his teeth and boarded the ship back to Africa. Legend says he let out a roar like a wild beast before boarding. The hunter had become the hunted.
Sunset at Zama, the Stair of Two Gods. October 19th, 202 BC. History held its breath here. On the wasteland of Zama, two massive armies were assembling. But before the fighting started, something extremely rare, almost poetic, happened. Hannibal invited Scipio to meet. It was the most suffocating scene in military history. The two top apex predators of the world met alone in a clearing in the center of the battlefield. Each brought only one interpreter. Imagine the image. On the left, 45-year-old Hannibal, his face carved by wind and frost, one eye blind from the swamp marches of his youth. He was the overlord of the old era, a tactical god who fought the entire Roman system single-handedly for 15 years. On the right, 33-year-old Scipio, young, handsome, elegant, eyes burning with confidence. He was the challenger of the new era and Hannibal's most perfect student. They stared at each other in silence for a long time.
History records that both were struck by the other's presence. Hannibal spoke first. The general who once slaughtered 100,000 Romans was talking about peace. "Scipio," Hannibal's voice was low, "look at me. I am Hannibal. I crushed you at Trasimene and Cannae. Back then, I thought I held the throat of destiny, but now I stand here begging for peace. Lady Luck is fickle. You are young and lucky now, just as I was, but do not become arrogant because of your strength in this moment. Accept peace. Carthage gives up all overseas territories. We keep only Africa. This is already a massive victory for Rome." It was wise counsel. Hannibal was teaching Scipio one final lesson: know when to stop. Scipio listened quietly. He looked at Hannibal like he was looking at a wounded father, but he shook his head. "Hannibal," Scipio replied, "this war isn't about territory, it's about survival. You started the war. You attacked our truce ships during the ceasefire. Rome does not accept conditional surrender. We want total submission. Either you leave your army to luck or you kneel to Rome." Negotiations collapsed. The two turned their horses and rode back to their camps. They both knew what happened next would no longer be a game of schemes, but pure violence. It would be a duel to destroy the other's soul. Back in camp, Hannibal looked at his final trump card. Not infantry, not cavalry. It was 80 African forest elephants. This was the most terrifying heavy weapon of the Mediterranean world. Hannibal's plan was simple. In the first second of battle, use these 80 biotanks to smash the Roman lines, create chaos, and have the infantry follow up to harvest. It was a violent, direct, almost indefensible opening. Hannibal believed no one could hold formation in front of 80 mad elephants. But he forgot one thing. Standing opposite him wasn't just a Roman army, but the ghost legion that had stewed in Sicily for 11 years. They were immune to fear. Killing the elephants. The lanes of death. The dawn of the final battle. The armies lined up. Hannibal's 80 war elephants stood in the front row like a gray wall. Their trumpeting made the war horses unrestless. Hannibal dropped the flag. The elephants began to charge. The earth began to tremble. Can you imagine the pressure? Hundreds of tons of flesh and ivory rushing toward you at 20 miles per hour. Pebbles on the ground jumping, dust obscuring vision. An ordinary army would have collapsed by now. Soldiers would instinctively bunch together, which is exactly the target elephants like best. The denser the crowd, the more people get trampled. But Scipio stood behind the lines, terrifyingly calm. He had anticipated this move. Remember the cohortal tactics he trained in Sicily? Just as the elephants were about to smash into the Roman line, the legion did something contrary to instinct. The trumpet sounded. The originally tight Roman phalanx suddenly opened like automatic doors. Soldiers moved rapidly to the left and right, leaving wide, straight lanes right through the middle of the formation. This was Scipio's trap. An elephant is an animal. An animal's instinct is not to hit a wall. If there is a path, it runs down the path. These 80 angry war elephants charged straight into these lanes of death the Romans had prepared. At that moment, the light infantry ambushing on both sides of the lanes went to work. They didn't use javelins. They blew trumpets and banged on their shields. Doot! Bang, bang, bang! Piercing noise exploded in the elephants' ears. At the same time, countless javelins stabbed at the elephants' most vulnerable trunks and eyes. The elephants were terrified. They stampeded down the lanes, passing straight through the Roman army like water through a sieve, causing zero substantial damage to the Roman main force. Worse, some spooked elephants turned around. They charged madly back into Carthage's own lines, trampling countless Carthaginian cavalrymen. Hannibal watched this, his heart sinking. His final opening ace not only failed, but blew up in his face. But the battle had just begun. The elephants were gone, but Hannibal had his final trump card. Not infantry, not cavalry, the old guard. This was a legendary unit that had followed Hannibal through Italy for 15 years. They had never been defeated. They watched the Romans approach, their eyes holding only cold indifference.
The Ghost's Revenge. The infantry lines smashed together. It was a meat grinder. The first 2 rows of soldiers fell almost instantly. Now it was time for Scipio's ace to play. He didn't place his strongest troops in the rear, as tradition dictated. He pushed those 2 legions of Cannae survivors, those exiled ghosts, right to the very front. These were madmen living solely to wash away their shame. When these Roman veterans saw those familiar Carthaginian faces across the line, 14 years of pent-up hatred exploded. They didn't need commands. They didn't need speeches. They threw themselves at the enemy like wild beasts. Every thrust of their short swords was a debt collection from fate. This is for Cannae. This is for 11 years of exile. Even so, Hannibal's old guard remained as solid as rock. The 2 sides were locked in a stalemate, bodies piling up like mountains. At this moment, the decisive factor appeared. Remember the cavalry Scipio sent out? They had routed the Carthaginian horsemen at the start of the battle and vanished over the horizon. Hannibal thought they were gone, chasing stragglers, but in the most grueling moment of the battle, when both sides were near exhaustion, dust rose on the horizon. Not a few dozen riders, thousands. Massinissa, the Numidian prince who defected to Rome, had returned with his cavalry. They appeared directly behind Hannibal's army. The scene looked exactly like Cannae 14 years ago, only this time it was Hannibal being surrounded. Cannae! Cannae! The Roman soldiers chanted the name feverishly. The name that once terrified them had become a spell of victory. Hannibal's army collapsed. 20,000 Carthaginians were killed. 20,000 were captured. Hannibal himself, guarded by a few horsemen, fled the battlefield in panic. When the god of war looked back, he saw not his glorious phalanxes, but a field of corpses and Roman eagle standards. He lost. He lost completely. Scipio didn't just defeat Hannibal, he completely crushed his mentor in the very fields Hannibal mastered most, encirclement and psychological warfare. The student had surpassed the master. Ruins and eternity. The system's victory. After Zama, Carthage surrendered. This time, Rome gave them no chances. The treaty was harsh beyond belief. 1. Carthage surrenders all warships, keeping only 10 for anti-piracy. 2. Hand over all war elephants and promise never to train them again. 3. Pay 10,000 talents of silver, an astronomical sum, to be paid over 50 years. 4. The most lethal clause. Carthage cannot wage any war, even in self-defense, without Roman permission. This meant Carthage's sovereignty was stripped away. It was no longer an empire, it was just a massive Roman farm. And Hannibal, he survived. He even served as Carthage's chief magistrate for a few years after the war, trying to pay off the indemnity through reforms. But the Romans wouldn't let him be. Eventually, to avoid the humiliation of capture, the man in his 60s took poison while in exile. Before he died, he left a famous final sentence: "Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." So why did Hannibal lose? Did he lose on tactics? No, until the very last moment he was still a genius. Did he lose to luck? Maybe, a little. But the real answer lies in those gold rings. The Carthaginians viewed war as a business. When Mago poured out the rings, the Carthaginian Senate saw profit.
They calculated the return on investment. When the war became too expensive, they hesitated. They stopped supporting Hannibal. The Romans viewed war as survival. When 80,000 men died at Cannae, the Romans saw a price that must be paid. They didn't care how many died or how much money it cost. As long as Rome had one breath left, the system would keep turning, keep drafting, keep attacking. Hannibal was a perfect individual. Rome was a perfect system. In human history, individual heroism might win battles, but only a powerful system wins wars. The strength of the Roman legion wasn't that their swords were sharper, but in that collective will to refuse to acknowledge defeat. This will forged a group of farmers, slaves, criminals, and exiles into an army that conquered the world. Scipio Africanus, the conqueror, was later ostracized by Roman politics and died in exile too. It seems to confirm a cruel truth. To the system of Rome, even a hero like Scipio was just a part. Parts can be replaced, but the system must be eternal. If fate knocked you down into the dust of Cannae, would you calculate your losses like a Carthaginian, or would you grit your teeth, crawl out from under the dead, and fight for another 15 years like a Roman? Twilight of the Heroes. The Ungrateful Republic. You might think the story ends with the cheers at Zama. That's the Hollywood ending. Real history is much darker. Scipio saved Rome. He pulled a nation back from the brink of extinction and placed it on the throne of world hegemony. By all rights, he should have been deified. But what was his reward? Suspicion, trials, exile. This is the dark side of the Roman Republic. It fears heroes. In Roman political logic, a general who is too powerful and too successful is the greatest threat to republican liberty. Scipio shined too bright. When he walked down the street, the people's worship of him exceeded their respect for the law. This made the old foxes in the Senate, especially the die-hard Cato the Elder, feel a chill down their spines. And so a political witch hunt began against the savior of the nation. 187 BC, 15 years after Zama, Scipio was summoned to the Senate for trial. The charges were ridiculous: embezzlement and corrupt lifestyle. They accused him of pocketing 3,000 talents during the Eastern Wars and criticized him for wearing Greek silk robes instead of looking like a plain Roman. Imagine the scene. The Roman Forum was packed. Scipio, who once commanded thousands, stood alone in the dock. Opposite him was a prosecutor, spewing eloquent filth, attacking the hero's character. Scipio listened to the charges. There was no anger on his face, only deep exhaustion and disappointment. When it was time for him to defend himself, Scipio did something incredibly dramatic. He took out his account books and in front of everyone tore them into pieces. Then he turned his back on the judges and faced the thousands of Roman citizens in the square. His voice boomed as if he were commanding on the battlefield. Romans, on this day, years ago, I defeated Hannibal at Cannae and won you peace and prosperity. Today is not a day for arguing. Today is a day to thank the gods. I'm going to the temple of Jupiter to pray. If you remember who saved you, follow me. It was a checkmate. The court emptied instantly. All the judges, the audience, even the clerks recording the trial threw down their pens and followed Scipio to the temple. Only the prosecutor and a few of Cato's cronies were left standing awkwardly in the empty square. It was a victory of public opinion, but it was Scipio's swan song. He won the PR battle, but he saw through the country. That night, Scipio left Rome. He swore never to step foot in the city again while alive, and not to leave his ashes there when he died. He retired to a country estate in Liternum. There, the god of war who conquered Africa lived out the rest of his life in solitude. Before he died, he wrote his own epitaph. The words still carry a bone-chilling cold today. Ungrateful fatherland, You will not even have my bones. This is how Rome treated its heroes, and this is why later Caesar decided not to endure it, but to cross the Rubicon and bury the Republic with his own hands.
The old lion's last roar. Cut to Carthage. After the war, Hannibal wasn't executed or exiled as many imagined. Instead, he did something that terrified the Romans even more. He was elected as the highest magistrate of Carthage and started reforms. Hannibal proved he wasn't just a military genius, but a top-tier politician. He found that Carthage lost the war because of internal corruption. The merchant oligarchs had been embezzling for years, leaving the treasury empty. Hannibal launched an anti-corruption storm. He audited the books and forced corrupt officials to cough up the money. A miracle happened. Within a few years, Carthage not only paid the huge indemnity to Rome, but its economy actually began to recover. This terrified the Romans. Hannibal is alive, and Carthage is getting stronger. This Hannibal-phobia settled over the Tiber River again. A Roman delegation arrived in Carthage, ostensibly to mediate a dispute, but in reality to force Carthage to hand over Hannibal. Hannibal knew he couldn't escape this time. He refused to implicate his homeland. In the dead of night, he rode out of the city he had protected all his life. Thus began his long, bleak exile. He went to Syria, to Crete, finally to Bithynia, in modern Turkey. Everywhere he went, he tried to convince local kings to rise up against Rome. Give me an army, and I can defeat them. That was Hannibal's obsession. But times had changed. No one dared challenge Rome's hegemony. The kings were polite to his face, but behind his back they prepared to sell him to Rome as a gift. 183 BC, Bithynia. Roman soldiers surrounded Hannibal's hideout. The 64-year-old man saw the familiar Roman armor through the window. He smiled. It was a relief. He took out the ring he had carried for years. Under the gem lay a deadly poison. Before he took it, he spoke that famous last line, the sharpest satire of Rome's relentless fear. Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death. Minutes later, the god of war fell. Ironically, in the same year, Scipio also died of illness in exile. The two greatest rivals died in the same year, both abandoned by their countries, both dying in loneliness. Their deaths marked the end of an age of heroes. From then on, the Mediterranean entered the era of systemic rule. But the story isn't over. Hannibal was dead, but the shadow he left behind, or rather, the curse, still loomed over Rome. To eliminate this curse completely, the Romans decided to do something that violated the baseline of human civilization. This brings us to the theme of extinction. Total destruction. The warning of the figs. Fast forward to around 150 BC, more than 30 years after Hannibal's death. Carthage had become a docile commercial city. No army, no ambition, just quietly doing business. But in the Roman Senate, one man refused to let them go, Cato the Elder. Every time this stubborn old man spoke in the Senate, whether the topic was sewer repair or agricultural taxes, his closing sentence was the same. Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum. Furthermore, I consider that Carthage must be destroyed. One day, Cato staged a carefully planned performance in the Senate. He pulled a handful of fresh figs from the folds of his toga and showed them to the senators. "Look at these figs," Cato said, "plump, fresh. Do you know where they are from? Carthage. They were picked in Carthage 3 days ago. What does that mean?
It means the enemy that nearly destroyed us is only 3 days' sail away. And their agriculture has recovered so well, their land is so fertile. As long as Carthage exists, Rome is not safe, or rather, Rome cannot monopolize the wealth of the Mediterranean. Greed and fear, the two most powerful drivers, were ignited. The Romans began looking for an excuse. They incited the Numidians to attack Carthage. Carthage, pushed beyond endurance, was forced to defend itself. This violated the treaty, no war without Roman permission. The excuse was found. The Third Punic War began. This wasn't a war, it was a slaughter. 146 BC. The Roman army surrounded Carthage. This time the directive was clear: no surrender accepted. The goal is physical erasure. Knowing death was certain, the Carthaginians erupted with astonishing resistance. Women shaved their heads to weave bowstrings. Temple beams were torn down to make catapults. Even slaves were freed to fight alongside their masters. The siege lasted 3 years. When the Roman legions finally breached the walls, street fighting raged for 6 days and nights. Note this detail. The Roman commander, Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the elder Scipio, ordered the fires. The fire burned for 17 days. In those 17 days, most of Carthage's 500,000 population died from fire and starvation. Only 50,000 survived, all sold into slavery. History records the final tragic scene. The Carthaginian commander, Hasdrubal, a common name, surrendered in despair. He knelt before Scipio, begging for his life. But his usually gentle wife stood on top of a burning temple. She was dressed in her finest robes, holding her 2 children by the hand. She shouted down at her groveling husband, "You coward! You betrayed your country and your gods!" Then, in front of the entire army, she killed her 2 children, threw them into the flames, and leaped in after them. This was the end game of Carthage: fierce, tragic, absolute. As Scipio watched the once glorious city turn to ash, he wept. His lieutenant asked him, "General, this is a great victory. Why do you weep?" Scipio quoted lines from Homer's Iliad. "The day shall come when sacred Troy shall fall, and Priam and his people shall be slain." He turned to his lieutenant, fear in his eyes. "I look at this fire and feel I am seeing the future of Rome. All empires eventually face this moment. Today is Carthage. One day it will be us." It was a terrifying prophecy, because at the exact moment Carthage died, the cancer inside Rome began to spread. The massive wealth and slaves brought by this war would destroy Rome's social structure, trigger a century of civil war, and ultimately bury the Roman Republic.
The engineering of death. The butcher's knife. If you ask a modern person what the Roman legion's strongest weapon was, most would say discipline. But to a Macedonian soldier in 200 BC, the most terrifying thing about Romans was the ridiculously short sword in their hands, the gladius hispaniensis. Let's switch to the battlefields of the Macedonian Wars. The Macedonians were used to long pike phalanxes. In their concept of war, death was usually clean, pierced by a spear, a small hole, bleed out, by gentleman's death. But when they first encountered the Roman legion, they were sickened, literally vomiting. The Roman historian Livy left a bone-chilling account of the Greeks clearing the battlefield. When they saw bodies, arms chopped off at the shoulder, heads split in 2, exposing brains, guts spilled on the ground, the Greeks felt a deep horror. They realized what kind of beast they were fighting. This is the design philosophy of the gladius hispaniensis. It is only 20 to 24 inches long, very short.
This means Roman soldiers must get in close. The horror of this sword lies in its versatility. Its point is incredibly sharp, designed to pierce chainmail. Its blade is thick, capable of hacking off limbs. But the most important thing is the logic of its use. Imagine the Roman line fighting. Soldiers use their massive body shields, scutum, to slam into the enemy, knocking them off balance. In that split second of opening, the short sword stabs out from behind the shield. No wide swings needed, just a simple 2-inch thrust forward. Stab the gut, twist, pull out, next. It is an assembly line of slaughter. On a crowded battlefield, enemies with long swords or spears can't swing them, while Romans with short swords operate as nimbly as surgeons. To the enemy, this isn't combat, it's vivisection. One-time engineering. In ancient war, a shield is your second life. Disable the shield, and you win half the fight. The Roman heavy javelin, the pilum, was designed specifically to delete shields. It looks strange, a long wooden shaft connected to a thin iron shank ending in a pyramid tip. Many enemies laughed when they first saw it. That thin iron rod will bend if it hits anything hard. Exactly. That is the genius of Roman engineering. It is designed to bend. Imagine two armies about to charge, 15 yards apart. The Roman legion unleashes a volley. Thousands of javelins fly with massive kinetic energy. If you block it with your shield, congratulations, you survived. But the barbs on the tip jam into your shield. Then, because the iron shank is soft, the heavy wooden shaft bends downward, dragging on the ground. Now you have a 5-foot heavy wooden pole hanging off your shield. You can't pull it out, barbs, and you can't fight holding the shield, too heavy and unbalanced. You have only one choice: drop the shield. In the second you drop your shield and expose your body, the Romans are already in your face. And this bendable design has another brilliant use: anti-recycling. On battlefields, soldiers often pick up enemy spears and throw them back. But once a Roman javelin hits the ground, the iron shank deforms. The enemy can't use it. This is the ancestor of single-use weapons. This isn't just blacksmithing, it's industrial design. The Romans applied material science to killing. They calculated every detail to ensure maximum tactical value from every throw. The instant city. If your enemy is Gallic, they camp casually. Find a clearing, light a fire, sleep, post a few guards. A night attack is a chaotic disaster. But if your opponent is Roman, you see a sight that breaks the spirit of barbarians. No matter how tired the Roman soldiers are, no matter if it's raining, the first thing they do when they stop in the afternoon is never rest. They take out shovels and pickaxes. In 3 hours, a fortress appears out of nowhere in the middle of a wasteland. This is not an exaggeration. The Roman marching camp, castra, has a strictly standardized process. 1. Dig the trench. 2. Build the earthen wall. 3. Erect the palisade. Every soldier carries 2 wooden stakes. 4. Plan the streets. The layout inside is always the same. Every soldier knows exactly where the commander's tent is, where the hospital is, where the stables are, even in pitch blackness. What does this mean? It means that even a raw recruit awakened by an alarm in the middle of the night knows exactly where to run and where to find weapons. This is extreme order. To the enemy watching from the hills, this is a massive psychological blow. Imagine tracking this army for days. You watch them march 20 miles carrying 60 pounds of gear. You think they're exhausted, ready to be ambushed. But as the sun sets, you see a square, heavily defended wooden city rise from the plain. Inside, everything is orderly, smoke rising from cooking fires. You feel a sense of despair. Are these men machines? Do they never tire? Josephus, a Jewish general who later surrendered to Rome, once lamented, "Their drills are bloodless battles, and their battles are bloody drills." This extreme logistical and engineering capability is the root reason why Rome could afford to lose Cannae, 80,000 dead, and still win the war. Soldiers can die, but the blueprint for this system remains. As long as there are people, give them shovels, give them swords, and 3 months later, you face an identical Roman legion. The price of victory. Let's go back to the Roman countryside after Cannae. Suppose you're a Roman farmer. You answered the call to fight. You fought overseas for 10 years, luckily survived, and returned home covered in scars. You thought you'd get a hero's welcome, then return to your small farm and live a peaceful life. But when you open your door, you're stunned. Your fields are barren. Because you were gone, your wife couldn't plow alone, or because of debt, the land was annexed by a rich neighbor. Worse, you find you are unemployed. Because Rome won, countless prisoners were shipped back to Italy and turned into slaves. The great landowners now use mass slave labor. Slaves don't need wages, just food. You are a free man. You have a family to feed. Your labor cost is too high. You cannot compete with slaves. This is a massive historical irony. The Roman legion conquered the world, but the loot they brought back, slaves, destroyed the foundation of the Roman legion, the yeoman farmer. Countless veterans like you went bankrupt. Forced to sell their land, they flooded into Rome, becoming the proletariat. They gathered in the streets, angry, hungry, and violent. They were once the guardians of the state. Now they're the instability of the state. And here, ambitious men saw opportunity. If the state won't feed us, we will sell our lives to whoever gives us bread. This is the soil that birthed warlords. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar. These names are about to take the stage. They no longer fight for the Senate, they fight for their private armies. The slaughter of Cannae didn't till Rome, but the wealth inequality and slavery after the war were slowly strangling the Republic.
Alternate history. The impossible siege. Let's turn the clock back to that bloody afternoon in 216 BC. Hannibal stands on the pile of corpses. Suppose he listened to Maharbal and ordered the army to march straight on Rome. Distance, about 250 miles. March time, 10 to 12 days at a forced pace. When Hannibal arrived at Rome, what would he face? Rome was not an empty city. Although the main legions were gone, there were 2 urban legions inside, mostly old men and underaged boys, about 10,000 strong. And Rome had walls. The Servian Wall, old but still a stone defensive line. Hannibal had no siege equipment, no catapults, no towers. His army was a field army of light infantry and cavalry. If you think Hannibal would ride elephants to smash down the gates like in a movie, you are wrong. Elephants can't break stone gates. So Hannibal could only besiege. But a siege needs 2 things, food and time. Hannibal was in enemy territory with no stable supply line. The scorched earth policy around Rome meant he couldn't forage. Rome had granaries inside and water from the Tiber. Most critical were Rome's allies. Although Rome's main force was gone, the Latin League remained. Once Hannibal was pinned under Rome's walls, surrounding city-states would send reinforcements to encircle him from behind. The hunter would become the hunted. So military historians agree, Hannibal didn't attack Rome not because he was stupid, but because he was too smart. He knew it was a trap. But there is one variable that could have changed everything: the domino of fear. That variable is the contagiousness of fear.
If Hannibal actually appeared under the walls of Rome, displaying the severed heads of the consuls and those thousands of gold rings taken at Cannae, would the civilians inside Rome riot? Would those steadfast allies, seeing Rome surrounded, think Rome is truly finished this time and defect to save themselves? Historically, Rome held on because Hannibal was not there. Fear was abstract. Once fear becomes a concrete, visible threat, psychological defenses often collapse before physical ones. If a riot happened inside Rome, if someone opened the gates, then today's world would be completely different. 1. Language. We might not speak English, heavily influenced by Latin, but some Semitic language based on Phoenician. 2. Law. Roman law might not exist. Commercial contract law might be more developed, as Carthage was a commercial civilization. 3. Religion. Christianity might never have spread on the soil of the Roman Empire. 4. Geopolitics. The Mediterranean wouldn't be a unified Roman lake, but a multipolar world. Would that world be better or worse? No one knows. But one thing is certain. The foundation of Western civilization as we know it was laid in those few days after Cannae by Roman stubbornness and Hannibal's hesitation. Epilogue. The lesson of blood and gold. We end here. Let's go back one last time to that image. 216 BC, the floor of the Carthaginian Senate, that pile of glittering gold rings. That was a pile of glory and a pile of curses. Hannibal thought those rings represented Rome's death, but he was wrong. Those rings were actually the admission ticket to Rome's adulthood. In this story, we witnessed the collision of two distinct civilizational logics. Carthage tells us the world is a business. Investment needs return. Risk must be controlled. When war becomes unprofitable, cut your losses. This is a rational, shrewd logic that modern people understand easily. Rome tells us the world is a survival game. In the face of survival, there is no cost analysis, only at all costs. This is a barbaric, stubborn, but immensely powerful logic. Hannibal lost not because he wasn't strong enough, but because he was an artist trying to disassemble a mountain with a scalpel. He cut off countless pieces of rock, but the mountain remained. Scipio won not because he was smarter than Hannibal, but because standing behind him was a machine that could keep roaring even with half its parts missing. Today, walking the streets of New York, London, or Tokyo, we still live in the legacy left by the Romans. Our laws, our military structures, our republican ideals, even our definition of patriotism, all stem from that bloodbath 2,000 years ago. But the ghost of Carthage never vanished. When a civilization becomes too wealthy, when we start viewing everything as a business, when we are no longer willing to sacrifice comfort for an abstract ideal, are we unknowingly becoming Carthage? If another Hannibal appeared at our gates, would we resist to the death like Romans, or would we calculate if the cost of surrender is lower, like Carthaginian merchants? This is the greatest cliffhanger history leaves us. If you were the decision-maker back then, would you choose to be the wealthy but fragile Carthage or the poor but resilient Rome? Special Chapter: Tactical Anatomy. Why can't Cannae be replicated? Many military history enthusiasts ask the same question. Since the pincer movement of Cannae was so perfect, why was it so hard for later generals to replicate? Over the past 2,000 years, countless famous commanders, from Caesar to Napoleon, from Moltke to Schlieffen, have viewed Cannae as the holy grail of warfare. They dreamed of executing a perfect war of annihilation, but almost all of them failed. Why? because Hannibal what did at Cannae violated the basic survival instincts of human beings. Let's look at Hannibal's center line under a microscope. Deployed there were Gallic and Spanish infantry. Their mission was not to attack, but to retreat in order. Pay attention to those three words, retreat in order. On a battlefield of cold steel, the line between retreating and routing is razor thin. When tens of thousands of Roman heavy infantry press forward like a tank, the psychological pressure on the front-line soldiers is devastating. Hannibal required his soldiers to fight while taking casualties and simultaneously bend backward rhythmically to form a perfect U-shaped pocket. If they retreated too fast, the line would break, the Romans would punch through the center, and Hannibal would lose. If they retreated too slow, the pocket wouldn't form, and the Romans would notice the threat on the flanks. This required God-tier micromanagement. Hannibal himself stood in the center, shoulder to shoulder with his soldiers. He used his own life as collateral to stabilize that teetering defensive line. This is why Cannae cannot be replicated. You cannot find a second Hannibal who can make soldiers dance that precise tango of death under the pressure of certain death. And in the Battle of Zama, Scipio won because he saw through this. He didn't play the game of pushing and pulling lines with Hannibal. He used his cavalry advantage to attack the rear directly. This teaches us a profound lesson. All tactical miracles are at their core the extreme mastery of human nature.